investigation, law enforcement used the term targeted attack. And they said that they believed that the murders at the King Road house were targeted. But they've never clarified whether or not they believe the house or the occupants were the targets. And I think it's very telling that here we are well over a year later, and we still don't have an answer to this question. And what I want to talk about here is I want to talk first about what criteria is typically applied when a killer is searching for their target, but I also want to talk about the crime scene and what aspects of the crime scene could have led to law enforcement making the assessment that they made. And many people said, why did they lift the shelter in place so quickly? And I happen to believe it's because once they assessed the crime scene, they determined that this was a targeted attack. Again, they didn't know if it was the house or the students, but they decided based on the crime scene that this was isolated and it was targeted, and I think that's why they lifted the order in place. But let's get into the crime scene. And before we do that, let's talk about the three main criteria that is said to be used when a suspect is deciding upon their victim. There's three criteria: desirability, availability, and vulnerability. And desirability is what about their target helps them meet a certain goal, helps them sate a certain urge. The desirability has something to do with what does the victim mean to them? Does it have some kind of, does this crime fulfill a personal need? Accessibility or availability, that's about what degree of difficulty is going to be involved with committing this crime. What are the chances that the person that they are targeting will fight back or will call the police? What are the chances that they're going to get caught? And vulnerability, obviously, is how vulnerable are these targets? Are they walking down a street late at night? Is it a house with a broken door or a broken lock, or a house with no cameras? Things like that. That contributes to the vulnerability. So now that we have those three things understood, let's dive into the crime scene. When law enforcement arrived at the King Road house, there were 4 victims inside and 2 surviving roommates. We know very little about what the crime scene looks like. We've heard stories. We've heard there was a lot of blood. Well, that makes sense because of the number of victims. We've heard words like disorganized and frenzied. Now, these are words that you don't typically hear them applied when the crime is targeted to one specific person. So just keep that in mind. So what we also know, there was no forced entry. We haven't heard anything about anything being stolen from the residence. We didn't hear anything about anything being disrupted. So I'm going to assume that that's not the case. Nothing was stolen. The crime scene was completely normal, meaning nothing was out of place. The first thing they would probably assess when they get there is the number of victims. For a house full of 6 people at the time of the crime, 4 victims that's a large number. And one specialist said that they believed that if this was a potential serial killer, that they would have killed everybody in the house. How do we know that that wasn't the plan and that plan was just thwarted in some way? We don't know that. As I've said previously, I do happen to think that whoever committed this crime was a potential serial killer. I do think that this was the beginning stage. Now, we have the fact that 4 victims, 6 were home. Had there just been one victim, just one, that might say this was personal. Somebody came to this home with the intention of carrying out an act, or with the intention of harming one person. Now, maybe 2 people, because, let's say somebody happens upon them and they're killed as well as sort of collateral damage. 1 or 2 says very personal and targeted to the occupants of the house. But 4 to me says rampage. Something else that was probably considered when police arrived is the location of the bodies. Now, had all these bodies been found in the same general location, that could have contributed to the belief that a fight broke out. Had there been anything that looked like there was a struggle outside of that bedroom, right? Like, let's say in the kitchen or in the living area. If it looked like there had been activity in the house at the time of the murders, that might say, okay, this was a fight that broke out, and that's why, and that was the cause. But you had 2 sets of victims on 2 different floors at opposite ends of the house. That to me says the killer took a very, very specific journey from one bedroom to the next, when the door to leave was just steps away. See, I don't happen to believe that Xana was in the kitchen and he ran into Xana. And in the podcast that I've recorded for this episode, I go into why, and you can get the link to the podcast in my description. I'll explain there. So to me, it feels like, based on where the bodies were found, that this was a very intentional path that he could have just left and didn't. So we've got the number of victims, we've got where the bodies were found. There was no forced entry. Now that could go either way. Were they let into the house, or was it just easy to get in there because of the sliding glass door? And that's where the accessibility and vulnerability comes in. That door would make anybody vulnerable. And we know from an interview that Kaylee's family did that door wasn't locked. At least that's what they alluded to. And I'll link to that as well in the description. So that made them very vulnerable. Also making them very vulnerable and making this a prime choice, like a prime location, there were no cameras. And I think that is one of the big reasons why police think it could have been the residence that was the target, because of the lack of cameras. Of course, easy to get in, easy to get out, less chance of being caught. And where the house was located, that tree line right in front of that parking lot, where that house was located made it a very prime spot, adding to the possibility that police thought that the house was the target. Now let's talk about the brutality of the scene. We've heard, there was a lot of blood, it was gruesome. We don't know what that means. We don't know what kind of splatter or back splatter. We don't know what that looked like, if there was any. We don't know if there was a footprint trail. We don't know if there was a trail of blood. In fact, we've been led to believe that there was nothing outside those rooms. But in those rooms, what was said was, I think Kaylee's dad is the one who said there was a hell of a fight down there. That too doesn't say personal to me because of the number of victims. we know 2 were found in bed. 1 was found on the floor. We're not really sure where Ethan was found. What seems very likely is these were people who didn't provoke in any way. So it's not like someone could have been in the house and they just snapped. This says, the sense that I get is, and I don't say sense like I'm a psychic, I mean just from looking at everything. I wonder if once the suspect attacked the 2 women in the bedroom upstairs, they were so high that they just needed more. And so they continued on to Xana's bedroom because there was noise coming from there. Maybe a light was still on in the bedroom and he could see it from the hallway. I don't know. Or maybe he just saw her walking that way. You know, I tend to believe that it was Xana that said, someone's here. And I'm going to talk about something that happened to me yesterday that was eerily similar that made me rethink that part of someone's here. And again, I'm going to talk about that on the podcast that I'll link below. I don't think Xana was anywhere near the kitchen at the time that he came downstairs, because Dylan looked out her door and, according to the PCA, didn't see anybody. But I'll get more into that. So I think the reason why law enforcement hasn't been able to say if the house or the students were the target is because so many aspects of this case. There are some that say, oh, it was personal, and then there were some that would say, oh, no, it was the residence. And the lack of any connection that we know of, you know, according to Ann Taylor in that court document that I'll link in the description, they can't find any connection. So I think not having that connection has left this one question. There's so many unanswered questions, but I have a feeling this might be one of those unanswered questions that always goes unanswered. So what I want to know from you is, do you think it was the house or the occupants that were the target? And do you think there was more than one target? If you think that there was a target, do you think there was more than one? Because I'm starting to think there was 2, and I'll explain more about that in the podcast. Leave your comments below. I look forward to reading them.